Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenara Nerenberg, and this is Divergent Ideas, our new series. I'm so excited that you're here. We're taping live, and our guest today is Shadi Hamid. And Shadi is an incredibly accomplished columnist with the Washington Post and the author of several books. His career has been largely international, and his new book is The Case for American Power. Welcome, Shadi.
Hi, Jenora. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's great to see you again. And, as I mentioned before, my focus is definitely a little bit more on the personal side. So I'd love to kind of start with your personal background and some of your international experience, where you grew up, and then we'll get into your book.
Yeah, sure. So I'm born and raised in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. My parents came from Egypt, so I'm Egyptian American. I The key moments kind of in my life story, one of them was certainly 9/11. So I was a freshman in college at Georgetown when 9/11 happened. So I'm there trying to figure out like the kind of person that I want to be, where I belong, all these big kind of identity questions. And then 9/11 happens, it sort of politicizes me. I think before college, I just thought I'd live a normal life. Like I guess most people think. They don't really think they're going to be writers or in politics or speaking to large audiences about international affairs. But and in that sense, because of 9/11, I'm probably talking to you right now. I sometimes think about the counterfactual history of my own life if 9/11 wouldn't have happened. But it did, and it put me on a particular trajectory. So there's a lot to say about that. But in terms of just other things, I lived in the region in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, in Jordan, Qatar, and Egypt. So that was also another formative moment for me to see how, Arabs for the first time were really having a chance at a different kind of politics, that freedom and democracy, or at least some semblance of them, were within reach. Obviously, we know now that it didn't really work out, but at the time, that was a very heady moment for me. And in some sense, like all these different moments shaped me. Happy to talk about any of that a little bit more, but that's a little brief background. I am a political scientist by training. I did my PhD at Oxford, so I've always been interested in these questions of how do um, how do societies live with deep difference, and seeing that first in the Middle East, and then seeing it here in the U.S. too. In some sense, I think the Middle East offered a dark preview of what was to come in our own country. So in that sense, my Middle Eastern background and the fact that I'm American and love America, those are big parts of my identity, and they both sort of shape how I look at the world in kind of these complex ways.
Right. And then, going back even further, like, were there, you know, as a child, like you're growing up in the States, we all come from different families, we all have different personalities and traits. And were you kind of particularly drawn to kind of like what shapes people and behavior and systems, like sort of like philosophical underpinnings? You mentioned, growing up in a Muslim American family. So was this there from an early age, or did it kind of develop later in life?
Well, I think being Muslim American in a community that is largely not, I mean, the suburbs of Philadelphia, largely liberal, white, there were just a handful of Muslims in my school. And so I always had this sense that I was different. And I think just by virtue of that, you're inclined to maybe ask questions you wouldn't otherwise ask because you're presented with difference, and you have to make sense of who you are and who you want to be. So I think from an early age, I was sort of a debater. I liked contending with ideas. I was on the debate team in high school. I remember that I would get in arguments with people at the lunch table about different topics. I actually have this memory of a debate in high school on abortion where where we were going back and forth. So I was definitely engaged on some controversial questions um, at an early age. I had also spent 1 year in Egypt when I was younger. We would spend summers in Egypt. So I think going from the US to Egypt, and there I was different, but in a different way. In some sense, I didn't really belong. I was stuck between these two worlds. I was originally Egyptian, but I was also American. So I think my relatives in Egypt, they always saw me as like, oh, he's the American one. And that my Americanness was very much on display. I remember, and I talk about this in the book, conversations I had with my grandmother, where I would bring up the fact that, wait a second, why is Egypt governed by a dictator? Something about that didn't seem right to me. It didn't sit well with me. And I thought to myself, I knew that Egypt was an ally of America. So how is it that America was supporting a repressive dictatorship and this person ended up being in power for 30 years, Mubarak? And I would bring that up with my grandmother, and she would get very jittery, even though there was no one in the apartment besides us, and we were just talking, because she had memories of dictatorship and what that meant. And she had lived through another period in Egyptian history, which was probably, a rather brutal dictatorship, that of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s and 60s. So those memories would linger for her. And it was always like, let's be on the safe side and not even bring these topics up. It was almost as if by mentioning this, it would somehow arouse some kind of spirit in the part. It was like this sense that someone was always watching us, which is probably a sentiment that will be familiar to people who have lived under authoritarian regimes.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thanks for filling in some of the gaps. And so I'm able to kind of connect the dots a little better about your early interest and experience. And to your last point, I think I know I shared with you in our last conversation that I grew up partially with my Iranian stepmother, and I would sleep in the same bedroom as my Iranian step grandmother, and so there was kind of a similar feeling there of like, we don't talk too much about Iran. There was just sort of like a lot of cautiousness there, particularly, the revolution. Um, okay, so this was there from a young age. Fast forward, you write a bunch of books, you have this incredible like international reporting career. Um, you arrived at the case for American power, which is such an intriguing title and timing. And how long were you working on this book?
Almost like 2.5 years.
Okay, so
Not
rapidly,
continuously, but yeah, I took some breaks but yeah, but I think the ideas have been with me for much longer, but the actual writing period probably over the course of 2.5 years.
right, right. Okay. And so what was it like starting and ending the book through such a like wildly rapidly changing political climate?
Yeah, well, I started writing it before October 7th, and then October 7th happened, the aftermath, the Gaza war, which was really a seminal moment for me and has changed me. My politics have been altered because of that. I think before October 7th, I was people, I think for better or worse, would sometimes think of me as being in the anti-woke camp, that I was critical of what might be called wokeness or wokeism, and that I was allied with people of that view. And a lot of that world tended to be sort of center right. And those were my fellow travelers for a while. And then October 7th happens, and then I find that I'm becoming more progressive just because Gaza pushes me in a particular direction where I have common cause with other progressives. And this was, in some sense, it still is, I think, the moral crisis of our time. So that forced me to rethink certain aspects of the book. And I started to feel a little bit nervous about making the case for American power at a time when it seemed that America was doing awful things in the world and facilitating war crimes in Gaza and so forth. So I think that was challenging for me. And there were moments where I really wasn't sure if the book would continue, or if it would continue, it would be different. So I had to wrestle with that. And part of this book, an editor once said, we write the books that we need to read. So I sort of used the writing of this book to wrestle with these topics and to try to figure out what I felt about America. And in that sense, the book is part memoir. It traces my own evolution over time. And I want the reader to kind of wrestle with me. So that's why, like, I take the reader through a lot of my internal thinking process. And I didn't know exactly where the book would end up. I didn't know how I was going to reconcile my love of America and my belief in American power with the realities of Gaza. So there was a real tension there. And then readers can then find out whether or not I resolved those tensions and what kind of conclusions that I came to. But I did have this sense of like, how am I going to make the case to like young progressives or Arabs and Muslims, people who are just furious with America and what it's become, especially on Gaza? How can I tell them to believe in America when all of this is going on in the world? So I almost felt like, how am I going to own this argument? Will I be comfortable making it? And I think that a lot of us go through that when we write books. We're like, wait, like, am I 100% with my own argument?
Absolutely. Yes. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Well, you brought up so many interesting points. I think I agree that writing books is a great way to wrestle with your own thoughts and feelings and questions for sure. I share in that. And I think your journey was really remarkable. It felt to me like your conclusion was basically, yes, America is flawed, just as every nation is, but it's still the closest to the ideals that we should believe in. Like it's kind of the best of what we have. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the best of what we have or the least bad option. But that's a little bit framed a little bit negatively. I could also even talk about America as the last best hope. So there's an optimistic frame and a more pessimistic frame. But either way, I think America is far preferable to the alternatives. And the alternatives are primarily countries like China and Russia, which are brutal dictatorships. The question of democracy has always been very important to me. So the internal character of these systems matters. The fact that we're a democracy, however flawed, matters to, and it should matter to Americans. And I don't think we should take that for granted. And that this brings me back to what I was saying about my grandmother and this sense that, as a child of immigrants, I've seen the alternative. I think a lot of Americans, unfortunately, don't see the alternative. They take democracy for granted. And I don't think we should.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think your framing was so interesting, and I shared this with some of my readers on Substack as well. Just your whole argument and the piece that you wrote for Time about the kind of the merits of hypocrisy, which is such an interesting framing. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I argue in the book, I have a whole chapter on hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is generally seen as a really bad thing. And if you call someone a hypocrite, that's almost like a slur, and understandably so, because the hypocrite is someone who says one thing but does another, and we don't like that, and we shouldn't. But I think when we talk about nations, it's a little bit different. That if the charge of hypocrisy can be leveled against us, it means that people expect more from us. They believe in our better angels. And what they're complaining about is that we don't actually meet those aspirations. But what that means on the positive side is that we actually have aspirations. If we didn't have them, the charge of hypocrisy could not be leveled against us. So, I write in the book that to be seen as hypocritical is the cost of trying to be better than we actually are. And think about it, that um, to take a kind of contrast, Donald Trump is not a hypocrite because he doesn't actually aspire to greater moral values. He doesn't even pretend. I think there's some value in pretending because in pretending, in trying to be better, in using rhetoric that aspires to moral greatness, even if we don't live up to it, that we're reminding ourselves of what we could actually be. It's always there in the back of our minds. So when one president after another in American history talks about the sense of moral purpose that we have abroad, then we're all, as Americans, we're all aware of that story. We're all aware of that tradition. So it gives a lot of us something to fight for. And we can actually call out our leaders and say, well, you guys are using this grandiose rhetoric about promoting democracy abroad, but are you? And we can hold them to account. And I think there's something powerful about that. Hypocrisy isn't really something you associate with countries like China and Russia, because no one really expects the Chinese regime to be promoting or supporting democratic ideals abroad. They don't even claim to want to do that. So I think that if you have to choose between those two alternatives, I take the hypocrite over the anti-hypocrite any day.
Mhm.
And that's also why I think Donald Trump is so dangerous. He's the first anti-hypocrite really in the history of the American presidency. So I think we have a live example, and we can sort of say, well, do we like Donald Trump's approach better? The good thing about hypocrisy that it offers us an opportunity to close the gap. So with hypocrisy, you have a gap between ideals and reality. Then the question is, what do you do about that gap? And my answer would be we try to close it. One way of closing it is to say, forget about the ideals. We're never going to live up to them. Let's just not even aspire to them. The approach that I argue for in the book is the opposite, that we try to bring our reality and our policies closer to the ideals. We'll never close the gap entirely, but at least we can try to close the gap.
Absolutely. So I have some thoughts on that. I really love this discussion of hypocrisy. I guess I have two questions. Like, one, why wouldn't your argument extend to individuals and like everyday behavior and actually taking a very similar analysis? Like, if someone has professed ideals and they can't live up to them, it sounds like there's still merit in that. And my second question is just like, your question about do we actually like this anti-hypocrisy sort of persona in Trump. And it seems like the answer is that a lot of people really do like it. And so I guess my question is, what do you make of that? So yeah, kind of like the individual, like, does this transfer to individuals? And then what do you think? What do you make of Trump?
Yeah, I think it does transfer sometimes to individuals that if you're trying to be moral in your own life, you're going to inevitably fall short. And falling short doesn't make you a bad person. It depends how sincere you are. And I think in some ways it's the difference between, and I've talked about this in a couple of places, the difference between the liar and the bullshitter. The liar, in some sense, is better than the bullshitter because the liar actually knows that they're concealing the truth and that the bullshitter doesn't actually care one way or another about honesty, if that makes sense. So you can make these kinds of interesting comparisons. I don't know if we really want to have a lot of liars in our lives, but I do think it is when people know that what they're doing is bad, when you have that level of self-awareness, there's something helpful about that. They understand at some intuitive level that they are obscuring the truth. Donald Trump is not really a liar. He's a bullshitter. There's no sense of truth and concealing the truth. It's just constant. bullshitting and him just saying whatever comes to mind. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. But I do think that this is oftentimes it seems like religious people are hypocrites because in some ways that's a problem, but you also have to respect that. And this is where I take your point. They're never going to live up to their own expectations, but you just want them to be aware of that and to be self-critical. And that's something that we can respect and appreciate. But if you have someone who says, well, I don't want to be seen as hypocritical by my friends and family and people in public life, so I'm not going to speak in the language of morality at all, I don't think that's a good option. We want people to actually talk about, to kind of inspire people, to kind of talk about these bigger ideals in public life. So politicians will always, a good politician will be seen as hypocritical because they're speaking to our better angels and they're trying to rally us to something better. So I think that, yes, there should be some allowance for hypocrisy in everyday life. Hypocrisy is in some sense part of being moral. As long as we understand that we'll always fall short. Now, the fact that a lot of people find Donald Trump appealing, I 100% agree with that. They do, and we can't avoid that conclusion. And I think there was a frustration that Democrats use a lot of grandiose language, but they don't actually care about ordinary Americans. And I think people got sick of that. This is the danger when you have the hypocrisy gap being too large for too long. It breeds cynicism. People start to say, well, the rhetoric is meaningless. That's why you always have to show that you're closing the gap. And if you don't, I think especially on something like Gaza, where it seemed like, okay, now we're not even pretending anymore. The mask came off entirely. And I think that led to a lot of disillusionment. And why a lot of people didn't, why a lot of especially young progressives didn't vote for Kamala Harris at the end of the day. It doesn't mean they voted for Donald Trump, or although some members of the Arab and Muslim community did on those grounds. But I do think there was a sense that the Democratic Party stopped even trying. It was just being very lazy when it came to its own ideals, its own professed ideals.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm trying to sort of reconcile your argument with the fact that Trump does have so many supporters and obviously uh, was elected, right? I'm thinking further about what must be kind of there in the American psyche, what Americans are hungry for. I hear you saying that it's bullshit, and so people are I guess falling for the bullshit. But at the same time, I do wonder if there's something deeper there in terms of like just kind of like just saying fuck it and like just like kind of just wanting a little bit of recklessness because people are so unhappy or they're feeling hopeless about like their economic opportunities and that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering if people just don't care about the hypocrisy or the bullshitting. And and then what that means and what that says, right? If it's satisfying some kind of need in people, compared to what you're saying, which I also agree with, which is that we need someone. I feel like what you're saying is that we need someone who is an incredible orator, the way Obama was, and I agree with you. I think it is so powerful to have a leader and an individual who calls us to our sort of like our higher selves and raises collectively sort of like the
Yeah.
higher social norm. So I totally agree with you there. But I'm wondering what you might make of that kind of tension if people are craving something else.
I think people are craving recklessness, whatever. Yeah. That there's anger in this country, and in some ways I get it. In other ways, I can't entirely. I mean, I'm kind of angry too, but I'm more angry at the Democratic Party for just sucking.
Mhm.
And it's like, how do we not have a real viable opposition party in this country? Something obviously doesn't feel right. I think a lot of us feel like something is off in the country, but also in our own lives. There's a crisis of loneliness, mental health epidemic. People just aren't happy in a fundamental way. They feel like something is lost or they're losing something important. People are moving away from religion. We're secularizing. That's plateaued a little bit, but we're still at all-time record lows when it comes to church attendance. All of these things create a crisis of identity. And I think that the appeal of someone like Trump is he just says, you know what? Like, as you said, like, F it, let's tear it down. These institutions haven't served us. And I think people are willing to be more reckless when they feel more hopeless. And that's the moment that we're in right now. So I think that we as people who want to push back against that, we have to understand where it's coming from instead of saying those people are deplorable, they're crazy, they're X, Y, and Z, and say people are hurting and they want something that feels more raw and authentic. And Donald Trump gives, like, there's something so remarkable about listening to him. You really do feel like there's no filter between his inner self, his inner thoughts, and what comes out of his mouth. And that authenticity appeals to people. I think it's also, and not to compare Zoran to Donald Trump, but I think that's also, there's something similar in the appeal of someone like Zoran Mamdani, that he has a genuine moral core to him. Every time he speaks, you get a sense that he's speaking from something that is true within himself, that he isn't just calculating every word. Donald Trump doesn't calculate, he just says. I feel like Mamdani, he's not calculating to find the exact statement that will appeal to the broadest cross section of the electorate. With a lot of Democrats, including Kamala Harris, there was always a sense that the wheels were turning whenever you asked them a question.
Mhm.
People just want to see you answering questions based on who you are. And that's the new kind of politics that I think Democrats have to lean into.
I totally agree. Yeah, I think that the Democrats are still just not like up to par. Like there's just something missing there that like the right has really tapped into like a brand or the memification of like life and like marketing and culture and like what appeals to kind of like our basic senses and like the left is just like not able to do that. I do think that that is still due to some of the kind of like um PC, like, overly self-silencing, like everything has to
Yeah.
fit these rigid rules. I mean, a lot of the, sort of anti-woke stuff that you wrote about, over the last few years. Um, so what do you make of that? Like, what do you think is the future of the left, or what do they need?
I think the future of the left is people like Mamdani. Maybe not exactly like him. Like you can't really have a democratic socialist in certain parts of the country. So you have to be adaptable in that sense. But I do think Gaza also presents a reckoning for the party internally, that now most Democrats are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are to Israel, which is a big shift from just a few years ago. It's actually a massive shift. So at some level, it'll be hard for like a real pro-Israel candidate in 2028 to kind of rise and also be against where the base is. There is that kind of fracture in the party. So the question is, which direction will the party go in? And will the leadership start to respect where the base is on some of these questions? The base wants a kind of moral position on Gaza, on healthcare, on they want fighters. That's what I think we all want. I think Republicans want fighters. That's why they voted for Donald Trump. That's just where we're at now as a country. We're just yearning for someone who just like says, "Hey, I'm going to stand up for you, and I don't care what anyone else says about it." And that kind of unapologetic stance, I think is hopefully where more Democrats will go. If they don't, I think we're in for a very difficult period because I think that means that I was going to say Donald Trump will have another shot at 2028, but I forgot he can't run again. But like his successors, I think will have a good chance of winning and continuing Republican dominance if Democrats don't get their house in order and start speaking in a compelling way to ordinary Americans.
So I think this is a really complex question because when you say that we need someone who's a fighter and someone who stands up for us, I think the issue is that the us has become so fractured. And I think this is so difficult to reconcile and it is something I've been thinking about a ton. We spoke before and I just wrote this book on groupthink and just the whole concept of diversity and like our country is so diverse now, which is so amazing and has been such a high ideal for us as Americans for I want to say centuries, but that's kind of like debatable, right? Um, so, but then I think it's hard, right? Because now when you say speaking up for us, people perceive that really differently. Especially with the Gaza issue and depending on where people fall on that. And so I think that's what's been difficult about Mamdani. Um, what are your thoughts on that? Like how can people respond to any kind of idea or feeling of us with the increasing diversity?
Yeah, I think having the us versus them is inevitable in politics. The question is, how do we present the us versus the them? Who are those categories?
Mhm.
And I think oftentimes on the right, the us and them is ethnic or racial. And
Mhm.
that's dangerous to divide a country along those lines when we're all Americans. I think where left-wing populists have a better shot at having a more productive approach is when they limit who the them is. You don't want the them, you don't to be too big of a part of a country. If you're saying immigrants are the them, then you're demonizing a large swath of Americans. But if you say, hey, um, the billionaires who control, like, this is what Bernie was very effective at doing in Mamdani and AOC. They say the us is the vast majority of the country. Working people, middle class people, and anyone, most Americans fall into those categories, and then they push against the kind of the um, the kind of big billionaire donors of both parties who prevent, I think, the Democratic Party in particular from having a more progressive approach, including on issues like healthcare. And that's where there comes to be this fracture between who the party is answering to in terms of their donor base and who they're answering to in terms of their constituents. So I think that, I mean, I don't love too much of that us versus them language, but I think that that's how people naturally do politics. They need to define themselves against something. They need to feel like they're fighting against people who are a problem. So I think that you can say that there are vested interests in this country that actually make progress and reform difficult. And to say that we have to kind of fight against them, I can see why that would be appealing to a lot of Americans. I think there's always a danger in using that kind of language, though. And even I'm right now, I feel like, do we really want to demonize all billionaires? Probably not, because they also do bring a lot to the country. So I'm a little bit torn on that, and maybe that makes me sound like a capitalist, God forbid. But I do think there are good things about the free market. And I do worry sometimes about this blanket approach of saying that everyone who is now a billionaire is a bad person. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But are there billionaires who are bad people who damage this country? Of course, yes.
Yes, I hear you. So, I mean, another angle to, that the left in particular can think about, and I think you mentioned earlier, and you talk about in your book, is hope, and that's something that Obama talked about so extensively in his, narrative and his messaging. And going back to kind of the thesis of the book or your conclusion about America, even though it falls short, it's still like the best of what we have. Um, I mean, I think that's a hopeful message, right? I mean, it does galvanize people. It can help people kind of lean into something. I do think that we suffer from a crisis of underexposure. I think as some of my readers know, I live abroad now, and it definitely, having such international exposure, and I've lived in Asia, off and on for 20 years. Um, it does give you a perspective about what you have back home and how it does stand out. Frankly, it also does point out some really amazing things about other places, so it's
Mm.
not like all good and bad and that kind of thing. But what are your thoughts on how people can have a deeper sense of hope in this sort of like
Yeah.
fractured era?
Well, one thing is I want progressives to be comfortable with power. And this is where I think powerlessness is a problem. And I talk about this in the book, how in my early days in college, I was very much active in the anti-war movement around the Iraq War. So I was helping to organize die-ins, teach-ins, tent-ins. We actually had a tent encampment at Georgetown that I helped lead, where we had a continuous presence in the main square at Georgetown for the full duration of the war. It was only one tent. This was before you had big tent encampments on college campuses. I guess we were a little bit ahead of our time. But there was something hopeful about that. But in the end, I feel like we reached a dead end. The war in Iraq happened even though we had people power. Millions of people across the globe were protesting against the war, but we weren't able to stop it. And instead, the war happened because there were a group of people in the Bush administration, the so-called neocons, who were able to capture the levers of American power. And at some point, I thought about that kind of juxtaposition. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be that guy outside the White House with a sign protesting every week. I don't, because that can actually breed a lack of hope because you feel like you have no agency, that you're not actually accomplishing anything. And this is where I think it's very important for progressives, people who are skeptical of American power, to actually be part of the system, to not just to go to protests, but to organize politically and to be active in the Democratic Party and to try to change it from within, to run for local office, to run for state office, and to actually be comfortable with the idea of power. You will get your hands dirty. Sometimes I think folks on the left, they're so in love with their own kind of sense of moral purity and moral righteousness that they don't want to be tainted by power. But power is a reality, and there's no way to avoid it. So I think there's actually something hopeful about this message of power that, and this is where Mamdani, I think, is very clear about that. In his victory speech, he used the word power several times, and that stood out to me. He was saying we have to wrest control of power from those who have had it for so long, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And I think that is ultimately a hopeful message.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, let's talk more about power and what you mean by that. And I think that when you talk about having the fear of power and how the left like fears it, the sort of psychology reporter in me is like translating that into, what is it like to have kind of an embodied sense of power? And it's kind of in some ways it's a so-called like masculine energy, and that's a lot of what the right has been offering, right, for the last several years. And I actually do agree that the left seems to kind of like back away from that. They don't want to be too much. They don't want to be too powerful or too masculine. But I agree that it's something that I think that the left should kind of embody more. I don't think that the kind of abundance fad that we had several months ago comes close to that. I think a lot of people were like, oh, this could be like this rallying cry for the left. I don't agree with that at all. Um, But I guess, like, so what do you mean by power? What does it feel like to you? What does it look like? And, I don't know, like, how can people lean into that?
Yeah, well, power as political scientists define it broadly is the ability of A to get B to do something they otherwise might not do. So there is an element of there can be an element of coercion, but sometimes there's an element of persuasion. It doesn't have to be by force. That's why we have hard power and we have soft power. So there's different ways of thinking about this. It's not all hard. It's not always using military force and that sort of thing. You raise a really interesting point about masculinity. I would never want to say that I'm not someone who's into this whole discourse around the feminization
Mhm.
of the Democratic Party, but I think there is a sense that Democrats are a little bit too soft, that they don't know how to stand up for themselves. They don't have a backbone. I don't know if that's masculinity per se or a masculine energy, but certainly Democrats have lost young men and hemorrhaged them to the Republican Party. So I think you could make a broader critique there about being more comfortable with masculine ideas like power and to not shy away from that. But I think it's also, I think sometimes there's this fantasy on the left that America could be a giant human rights organization and just go around the world promoting good things and our ideals. But at the end of the day, a country has to defend its own citizens. And that requires doing things that might seem a little bit morally compromised, that you do sometimes have to use your military, um, that sometimes wars are justified, that sometimes it's not just about multilateral institutions and respecting international law. Sometimes you have to actually impose your own will without recourse to international institutions. You can't always be waiting for the UN to act when there's a Russian and Chinese veto that's kind of built into the system. So I think sometimes, and it's also, I think, a question of pride. I think we've also on the left become uncomfortable speaking openly about our own pride in our country. There's actually a remarkable survey from Gallup that in the early to mid 2000s, around 85% of Democrats were either extremely or very proud to be American. That number in 2025 has dropped to 36%. It's one of the most precipitous drops in polling that I've ever seen. We are not comfortable saying we're proud to be American. And I've experienced this in my own life when I've said things like I love America. Some of my white liberal friends will look at me and be like, "What? Shadi, why are you using that kind of language?" They feel kind of instinctually uncomfortable. And I've even done this. I had my book launch last night and I used some of this rhetoric and I actually saw people in the front row just grimacing. They're just not used to hearing people kind of utter this language of
Mhm.
like, because also what I was saying is that the reason that we should want America to dominate in world affairs, obviously there's a lot of reasons, and we've like touched on what some of them are, but at some level, we should want America to dominate because we are American. There is almost like a nationalistic element here that we shouldn't shy away from. Of course, we want the best for our country. It's our country. And it's reasonable for other people to want the best for their countries too. But there's something almost uncouth about that when you just say, "Hey, America, this is our country, of
Mhm.
course." And you use that kind of rhetoric and it really puts people off. I think we have to find a way to
Mhm.
reconcile ourselves to that language. We don't have to always use that language, but I think that a lot of Americans can sense that when Democrats talk about their own country, when liberals talk about their own country, there's a kind of half-heartedness that puts them off. And that's something we got to work on, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, I mean, this does go back to some of the, like, if you want to call it woke or, whatever, this kind of being really entrenched in like a pessimistic narrative, right? And your kind of your argument around that it's kind of not cool to say that like you are proud to be an American, and people are like really surprised to hear that from you. And to me, that kind of goes back to the lack of exposure thing. Like if you haven't lived in other countries and you don't know how good you have it there. I also think that there's been something kind of uniting for a lot of people on the left around like hating America, and it's like so bad, and it's a lot of the like victim narrative, and we have to
Yeah.
do better. And I think to your point, I think that it has made you mentioned like white liberals being surprised. I think a lot of like this relates to what you're talking about with the being comfortable with power, because if you're constantly sort of like humbling yourself and like shying away from power, then you're not going to sort of like embody power, right? And so if you constantly feel like you have to put down what you have and you can't be proud of it, which is what the left has been saying, right? Um, is it possible that we're never going to look powerful or appear powerful because we can't have that sense of pride in who we are? And particularly, I think a lot of like white liberals don't feel comfortable because the focus is so much on what's not going well and all the injustices. And so how dare you point out something positive? Um, yeah, so I don't know. Like there's a lot to work out there.
Yeah. And I think that as critical as we should be about America and our own record abroad and at home, at least at home, America is more just and more moral on any number of metrics than it was 60 or 70 years ago. That should almost go without saying. I mean, we used to have Jim Crow, for God's sake, and it is like racial. We're not where we need to be or should be, and perhaps we never will be. I mean, in some sense, racial justice is like an asymptote, which is like the idea of a mathematical curve always sort of approaching a line but never quite intersecting it. I sort of see America as an asymptote in that way. But that shouldn't prevent us from saying, hey, actually, you know what? We've done a really good job compared to where we were before, and we should take some kind of confidence and gratitude about the progress that we've made. You should be able to say we have more progress to make, but also we've made progress already. And I think the victim narrative is dangerous, and this is where I think it's right to point out that a lot of the woke rhetoric, it feeds into this sense of self-loathing. And in the book, I talk about a concept called oikophobia, which is a term that isn't very well known. It's sort of the reverse of xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of foreigners, the fear of what is different and unfamiliar. Oikophobia is the fear of what is familiar, the fear of what is home. And I think the fact that we feel instinctively apologetic about home is a dangerous thing. Home is real. Home is something that we should value. And that could even be at a very local level. It's not just on the level of America as a nation. It's fine to like what is familiar, and it's fine to be a little bit unsure about what is unfamiliar. And that's sometimes like a hard thing for people to take on because it feels like very insular and closed. But we also have to recognize aspects of human nature that are immutable. Humans incline towards what is familiar.
Yeah, I know. I thought that that part of your book was like really, really, really fascinating. So what is the like where are you at now? I mean, I know when we finish writing books, it's like many months out until it like publishes. So do you feel the exact same way you did when you like the moment you finished writing, or like where are you at now and what's your kind of like message for the future?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated moment for the book to come out because of Donald Trump. And so when people see the cover of the book, which I love, it's like a very uh
It's
it's
gorgeous.
too far away for me to get it, but it's like a picture of the Statue of Liberty with a globe on top, and it's got like very dramatic colors. And there's some red in there too, and I think sometimes people associate red with MAGA. I think red is just an amazing color. It's very vivid, I think. But there is a risk that people see, like they see the title, The Case for American Power, and they assume things that are not actually in the book. They assume that I'm a cheerleader for Trump's America. That's not the America that I have in mind here. Or they think that I'm whitewashing America's sins, which I'm not. I think the only way to really embrace America's role in the world effectively is to acknowledge what we've done wrong in the past. The only way we can actually move forward is if we have a kind of critical awareness of the terrible things that we've done during the Cold War in supporting right-wing dictatorships, our unquestioning support of Israel for many decades now. These are all things that have to be held to account. And it's possible to be critical of America and also to love it. And that's a thing I don't want people to see those things as being mutually opposed. And I also do want them to believe in America despite Donald Trump, that Donald Trump has not ended the American project. If America was so weak that 2 terms of Donald Trump could destroy America as we know it, it wouldn't be worth fighting for, but it is worth fighting for.
So, what do you think a post-Trump America looks like? I've been trying to wrestle with this myself and having a kind of tricky time imagining it. It's like the before and after, but there's kind of like no going back to the before, or maybe you think there is. Is this like a whole new landscape? What do you think?
We're never going back to the way things were before. I think in that sense, Donald Trump will be remembered as one of the most consequential presidents in American history of marking a new period and ending a previous period. I think populism will be in the mainstream of American politics for a long time to come, whether it's right-wing populism or left-wing populism. I think anti-establishment sentiment will be at the forefront, and understandably so. The system hasn't worked for a lot of people, and people are angry, and they need to be able to channel their anger through politicians who respect their anger. So I don't think that's something I don't want us to be like, oh, Donald Trump is an aberration. Let's just try to just go back to the Obama years or think that that's even possible. That's putting our heads in the sand. I don't think that's possible. And I don't think that we will ever be able, there will still be damage from the Trump years. And we should try to rebuild, but it's not about going to the status quo ante. It's about trying to build something new upon the ruins of what Donald Trump brought to us, basically. And what that looks like, we have to be imaginative and we have to be creative. And it can't just be about, oh, norms, status quo, institutions, preserving the order. All of that is kind of small c conservative language. People don't want to just conserve what was there before. They want something that has a little bit more bite to it, something that's a little bit more radical, a little bit more populist, a little bit more intense, more raw, more authentic. That's where I think the future of politics has to be.
Well said, and that is a great ending point. Shadi, thank you so much for being here, and everyone should check out The Case for American Power. I know you're on the road, so people can definitely check out your other events and podcasts and excerpts. And is there anything else that you'd want to share or point people to with your promotion right now?
No, that just about covers it. I would hope that people consider reading the book, and even if they're skeptical about the premise, to give it a shot and to see what I have to say, and to follow me on Twitter. It's just my name, Shadi Hamid, and keep up with my work at the Washington Post, where I write a column.
Absolutely, yes. It's such a beautiful read. Thank you for writing it, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. My pleasure.